Thank you very much. There are many complaints about governments, but the harshest is this government grossly violates basic human rights. The idea is that all human beings have rights that everyone, including governments, are morally obliged to respect. When you look at the grossest violators, Nazi Germany, Soviet Union, Maoist China, almost no one denies the validity of the idea of human rights. But once you accept the idea of human rights, you have to wonder, do the governments that we know and accept and even love have clean hands? Or do they violate human rights too? To answer, we usually apply a simple test. If an individual treated other people the same way the government does, would that individual clearly be a horrible criminal? So if an individual deliberately kills innocent people, he's a murderer. Right? If an individual imprisons innocent people, he's a kidnapper. And if a government that does the same things violates basic human rights. And of course, a government can't justify its actions by just calling innocent people criminals, by saying, well, you're criminals because I said so. So if someone is peacefully living his life, then he is innocent, whatever the government might say. That, of course, is underlying the whole idea of human rights, because without that, there would be no human rights. Now, what does any of this have to do with immigration? A lot. Since we are in San Diego, I bet that everyone here has actually seen illegal immigrants with your own eyes. Right? So, now what are the vast majority of them actually doing? Well, working for willing employers, renting apartments from willing landlords, buying stuff from willing merchants, sending money home to their families, and they may even be sitting right next to you in class. They sure look innocent, right, and even admirable. But the US government can and does forcibly arrest and exile them to the third world. Now, why can't they all just come legally the right way? Because exile is the default. Exile is the default. They're all exiled unless the US government makes a very rare exception. Now, this is far less bad than killing people or imprisoning them, but it still seems like a severe human rights violation. Suppose the government were to exile you to the third world. Right? That would seem like a pretty bad thing to do to you, even though it's not as bad as killing you or imprisoning you. So if the government did that to you, wouldn't that violate your basic human rights? Now, you could very reasonably object that human rights are not absolute. There's a strong moral presumption against killing, imprisoning, and exiling innocent people, but maybe it's okay to do this if the overall consequences of respecting human rights lead to or the overall consequences of respecting human rights would be truly awful. All right, now the main problem with this objection is that when social scientists actually go and try to measure the overall consequences of immigration, they don't look clearly awful at all. In fact, the overall consequences of immigration look totally awesome. Most notably, right, this is a huge issue, we could have a whole additional debate on it, but let me just tell you the one big one, right? When economists estimate the effects of allowing all the talent in the world to freely move to wherever it wants to go, the usual estimate is this would roughly double global prosperity, roughly doubling global prosperity. That's an extra $75 trillion of production per year. That's a lot. Now, how is it possible that just letting people move around the world would increase production so much? Because even the world's lowest skilled workers produce vastly more in the first world than they do back at home. Now, even if all the other fears about immigration were bulletproof, they're not, but we don't have time to go into that, they're still dwarfed by this gargantuan economic gain of $75 trillion of extra production per year. So, as I say in my graphic novel with pictures to prove it, this is not trickle-down economics. This is Niagara Falls economics. So to effectively defend immigration restrictions, then saying that human rights are not absolute is not sufficient. You need to flatly deny that immigration is a human right. In other words, you need to say that while illegal immigrants that you meet on the street or that you see in class next to you may look like perfectly innocent people, they're not. They're actually guilty as hell. Now, the most popular argument here analogizes illegal immigrants to trespassers. No one has any right to be here without government permission. It's our country, so we set the rules. The obvious problem with this position is that it justifies a vast range of blatant human rights abuses that almost anyone would say are indeed human rights violations. So, if it's our country and we set the rules, why can't government exile citizens too? Right? Why can't we imprison people for saying the wrong thing? practicing the wrong religion, or having kids without government permission. I had forgotten that it was just a Catholic school when I wrote that, but so probably especially horrifying. Yes. All right, now, of course, you could say, well, that's never going to happen, so who cares? But this is a philosophy debate, so that is a cop-out. The point is not it's going to happen. I'm not claiming these laws are likely to happen anytime soon, or these changes. I'm just raising these to say, look, if the U.S. government, in fact, chose to do this, would it be violating your human rights or not? If it did, would it be a human rights violation? In the unlikely scenario that it did, would it be? Now, Professor Wellman, and I want to be very fair, I read his book beforehand so that I could do my best here. He has a much more sophisticated version of the story. Of course, I expect that he'll tell you himself, but let me pre-butt what I think he's going to say. Wellman defends immigration restrictions for legitimate states only. So he tries to get the Soviet Union out of the way, right? On the grounds that immigration restrictions are vital for freedom of association. Now, unfortunately, we have two conflicting freedoms of association here. Because I want to be free to associate with foreigners, and lots of foreigners want to be free to associate with me. Now, immigration restrictions deny us this freedom of association in the name of all the Americans who don't want my associates breathing American air. Now, who should prevail given there's a conflict? Well, this is where I really liked Wellman's work, so I'm going to quote some of it. So in his work, Wellman concedes what I think is a crucial premise. He freely admits that this popular notion that a lot of people have, that we all consent to the government, is a fiction. His word, fiction, also called a myth or even a lie. All right. Right? And furthermore, he says that, quote, the coercion states invariably employ is non-consensual, and as such is extremely difficult to justify. Wellman's words, not mine, end quote. So we don't really face a choice between two freedoms of association. We have a choice between freedom for real associations that we actually join and freedom for fictional associations that we're forced to join. So unless the overall consequences are clearly awful, I say the fictional association should lose in favor of the actual ones. And I will even have a slogan that I'll probably repeat more than once tonight. This is the first time freedom of association is only for free associations. Freedom of association is only for free associations. Now, my critics often tease me, or actually the technical word is troll because it happens on Twitter mostly, but they often tease me, should everyone on earth be free to immigrate into Bryan's house? Should everyone on earth be free to immigrate into Bryan's house? Now, their point is that treating immigration as a basic human right is utopian nonsense. My reply is there's really three competing positions on the right to immigrate. The first position, foreigners have a right to live in my house even if I don't consent, which is a view held by almost no one. Second position, foreigners have a right to live in my house if I do consent, which is my view. Third view, foreigners have no right to live in my house even if I do consent, which is the standard view I'm criticizing. Far from being utopian, affirming the human right to immigrate is just the moderate common sense position that when natives and foreigners voluntarily interact, strangers are morally obliged to leave them alone, unless, of course, the consequences are absolutely hellish. And this remains true even if the stranger is the government, and even if the government is popular. Thank you.